Good evening. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen for Muslim Network TV, and I am the host of the wonderful program Critical Talk. Tonight we're talking about war, displacement, and identity among refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Let me bring on my guest before I give my little bit of an opening, and that is Dr. and Professor Tarek El Aris, who is a professor of a lot of things. Um, the James Wright Professor and Chair of Middle Eastern Studies at Dartmouth, and Professor Elena Fiddian. Oh, do it.
Qasmiyeh, Fiddian-Qasmiyeh.
I had it and I lost it. I would, before I fully introduce him, because Professor Elena is in London, it's a little bit after midnight, joining us in what I think will be a wonderful conversation. But I wanted to open the conversation with something I found, I think, and this is when I think, particularly transcendent over the conversation we're going to have. In this text, Trials of Arab Modernity, Professor Tarek says modernity as quote unquote fun to the east or Africa, a site of technological development and absence of spirituality, especially. Is this a myth like the Anga, which is mocked and exposed in the translator's analysis? Now, he's talking about a book, but I don't think what comes before and after, he's saying what we think of as modernity. Is it really for everybody, everywhere, all the time? And has these terms that we want to discuss tonight become terms of modernity? You know, are humans being displaced and moved and running and some with something? Dr. Aris talks about in his book, Water on Fire. He's seeking asylum. All he got is a bunch of poems. And Americans don't read poems. So that kind of puts you up the creek without a paddle or a boat. Professor Elena has been all over the African continent looking at gender issues and all kinds of stuff from North Africa to South Africa. So I wanted to talk about in the differences. What about these terms? Because we don't know and never get an opportunity to find out about the lives of immigrants. The U.S. news shows bunches of people traveling along a ravine or not, you know, with their kids on their back, kind of pushing, uh, going forth. I don't know how to do that either. That's the immigrant, right? Then what we do is we put them in outdoor jails, and that's all they are is outdoor jails so that they can't escape. But the issues that both of you bring forth are issues we've never looked at. So I am going to uh, ask for this conversation. First, um, I want to discuss these notions and these terms. What is the difference between an immigrant and a migrant, and a refugee and an asylum seeker? Either one of you, both of you, not at the same time, but take it on. today?
Thank you, Dr.
This
Aminah.
evening.
I'll get started if I may, and then I'll pass over to Tarek. So these are obviously terms that describe people in different languages, sometimes for different audiences. So asylum seeker and refugee are often terms that are used to describe people at different points of their journeys through different institutions. So an asylum seeker is somebody who has approached a government or an agency, such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee, for protection. And they've had to ask for protection because they've had to leave their home and it's unsafe for them to return to that home. They're outside of their country of origin. And they have asked for sanctuary. So that's officially what an asylum seeker is, or who an asylum seeker is. Someone who's asked for sanctuary.
You said something about a journey through institutions.
What institutions? So when somebody leaves their home, their country of origin, if they've crossed an international border and they approach a state or a government, then they're not just taking a journey through a landscape, they're not just crossing the ravine, they're also crossing different political systems, different institutional systems, different potential authorities that can give them protection. So an asylum seeker is someone who's asked for protection from another state or from another institution. A refugee, officially, legally, politically, is somebody who has been granted protection from another state, a state that isn't their own state, or somebody who has been granted protection, or the need for protection has been recognized by the United Nations, for example. So these are labels and categories that are used by institutions to describe people. But they're also sometimes words that people use themselves to describe themselves. So to be a refugee is to someone who has sought refuge, who has asked for protection because they are unsafe and they don't have the protection of their state of origin. And then, of course, they become words that are used by the media or are used in the neighborhood or are used in conversation. And sometimes they don't reflect that need for protection and the right to protection that refugees have in the world, according to international systems which have long histories. And then migrants.
Well, let me problematize that a little bit. How can you have a right to protection? I mean, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, I think there is a conception of us as human beings, but these conceptions have to do with the system that guarantees and sustains our humanity and make sure that we continue to feel human and have the human rights that we deserve, and that these institutions or international organizations and states have committed to respect. And this has, I mean, people have written a lot, especially after the Second World War. This was a huge thing after the Second World War when you had huge refugee crises, including a lot of Jewish refugees, people like Hannah Arendt, a lot of philosophers who talked about this. Like, what does it mean to be human when you don't enjoy these rights anymore? When there is no state that says, you are my citizen, I give you a passport, I give you an ID, you can use it to vote, you can use it to move around, and if someone does anything to you, they are responsible, they are accountable to me, I will take care of you. That's why you go to your country's embassy if something happens to you when you're traveling. It means they are responsible for you. But when you've been displaced, when you lost your home, when there is no state that says, you are my responsibility, what's going to happen to you? So something about your rights as a human being that are supposed to be intrinsic, that are supposed to be innate, but also have to be guaranteed by some institution out there, by some government that says, Tarek is mine and I'm going to protect him wherever he goes and whatever happens to him. And so that's the problem we're facing in a lot of these situations when people no longer have that protection. So everything about their identity, their rights is put into question, and they are faced with incredible odds, horrible odds, other countries who might let them in or not, people who might discriminate against them.
Yeah.
It's almost like they have no rights anymore.
Yeah. Professor Elena,
Mm.
say a little bit about statelessness.
Mhm. Thank you. So absolutely, as Tarek just said, we understand in the modern political system that each of us has a state that is responsible for us and to which we also have duties. And that state gives us citizenship. When our child is born, that state issues a birth certificate. That birth certificate then enables children to access education, health, identity documentation that confirms who they are
In that state.
in that state, but also that document would be recognized by other states. So that's also how you can travel potentially internationally.
Well, you
Now,
have
stateless
I'm
people
saying
don't
that you
have
have
that.
places like Lebanon,
Mm.
which everybody wants for one reason or the other, and it was at one point a part of Syria under the Ottomans,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
Now, when
It was, yeah.
I watch a lot of videos. Anyway, when the European powers decide they want to break up the Ottoman Empire and divide it amongst themselves,
Mm.
one of the things that happens is Lebanon gets kind of gouged out and put over here, and Syria over there, right? Where do are those citizens now stateless
No,
or
I mean,
no?
this is what a very extreme form of redistricting that ends up
Mm.
disenfranchising certain communities. So you take the pen and say, okay, these people are gonna vote in this way, or they might be, and so this is how the Europeans drew the map that they eventually divided the Ottoman provinces, these Ottoman provinces that have become the modern states of Lebanon, Syria, historic Palestine, Jordan, all these states that we call today the Middle East. They've been pretty much carved up from
Mm.
the Ottoman. I mean, the Ottoman system was kind of like the US today. I mean, it was a federation, it was different. I mean,
Right.
different provinces that were all, they had governors, but they were all had the central power, which is in Istanbul, which is in Constantinople. So they've pretty much carved it up. And certain places, like you had something called historic Syria. I mean, you see it in Roman text, but you also had Mount Lebanon, which you see in the Bible. So you had these geographic places with people living in them and feeling very strongly as a form of identity in relation to them speaking certain languages. But as a modern political structure, that comes with the colonial gerrymandering that happened after the First World War.
Yeah. And there what we
That's
see, can
go
I
ahead.
just jump in here? So what we
No,
focus
tell me
on
to be quiet. Go
what
ahead.
we focus on a lot now is people crossing borders, but what you're also referring to there is when borders cross over people. So when, as Tarek
Mm.
said, when the lines are drawn, that is when the border shifts over different geographical spaces. And the drawing of that line on the map and the shifting of responsibilities and the possibility of taking tax from different people, that shifts the authority to whom you're paying tax changes because the location of the border has shifted. So you live in the same place. Tarek referred to Hannah Arendt
And
earlier.
it shifted on me, right?
When people in Europe, when people in their very house, half of their house was in one country and half of their house was in another country. So if depending on which
Get out
side of the
here.
living room you were sitting in, because of the way that the international border was drawn, Hannah Arendt writes about this, you were living in one country or the other.
Yeah.
Your wife on the other side of the sofa could have a different citizenship to you on the other side of the sofa because of where that line was drawn. So it is somewhat arbitrary, but then that becomes violent when the state decides who to include and who to exclude, who to give documents to, who to recognize
Right.
as a human being, which is often linked to documentation such as who has the passport, who has the identity document, the birth certificate, etc., and who therefore has the possibility of going to an embassy to ask for protection or to approach the authorities to ask for recognition as a human with rights.
Well, that's too much stuff to have. I mean, I lost my Social Security card for 2 years. So I would have been up the creek if they'd have drawn a line through my house. I mean, what am I? You know, you get you have a driver's license that's supposed to stand for everything, and that's it. You know,
Yeah.
people don't walk around with their passports
Yeah.
and other things. But I want to take a quick 2 minute break, but I want to come back and I want to talk about South Africa. I don't think anybody pictures South Africa having refugee camps. We know that the problems there are horrendous, and that while everybody, well, I don't know, everybody hoped that Mandela would cure some things. Mandela, you know, you can't cure overnight stuff that's been going on for decades. And then there are, I know, a pretty strong Indian Muslim migrant group there. I don't know about the Arabs. Tarek, have to tell me there. But I know about the but you never picture South Asians. I mean, not South Asians, South Africa having refugee camps. Let's take a 2 minute break and we'll come back. And I also want to talk about women. And then I'm going to go to Tarek's couch. Okay, there we go. Hello and good evening. Assalamu alaikum. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen for Muslim Network TV, and I am the proud host of Critical Talk. This evening I'm talking with two professors, Professor Elena Fiddian-Qasmiyeh. Did I almost get it?
Almost. Thank you so much, Dr. Aminah.
Darn it. And Professor Tarek Al-Aziz. And we're talking about, I'm sorry, El Aris. We're talking about displacement and refugees and migrants. And in this section, I'm going to ask Professor Tarek to help me with an interview of Professor Elena's work on. You have some stuff that's really interesting. One is ideal refugees, and the other is the text South to South. Well, it's not two, it's South dash South. So I want to go to ideal refugees. Tell us.
Well, I use the term ideal refugees to refer to a particular refugee camp in southwest Algeria, which is home to refugees from the Western Sahara, which is the name of the territory which these people have been displaced from. Sahrawi refugees who've been living in southwest Algeria since the mid-1970s, displaced from a former Spanish colony. And they live in a refugee camp setting, which depends very significantly on externally provided humanitarian assistance. And I use the term ideal refugees, to refer to how this group of refugees present themselves to the international community to ensure a continuation of humanitarian aid and of political support. So I talk about the ideal refugees as an image or a representation of people who've been displaced, with notions of...
Can you go back and tell us why they were displaced?
So long history, contested politics, a territory in northwest Africa, which was colonized. So Morocco was colonized or occupied by France. So we have Algeria and Morocco, the territories which are currently Algeria and Morocco, which were occupied by France. And we have what was the Spanish Sahara, which was occupied by Spain until the mid-1970s. And people have always lived across these geographies. And yet in the mid-1970s, when the Spanish dictator Franco was on his deathbed, instead of decolonizing this territory and returning the territory to the people who lived on this territory, there was an ongoing conflict with Morocco saying that this was their land, Mauritania saying that it was their land, so Mauritania in the south and Morocco in the north, saying this was their land. And about 125,000 people were displaced from a territory that's currently still not decolonized. So from 1975, 125,000 people approximately crossed over an internationally drawn border, as Tarek was saying earlier, into what is currently Algeria, and were forced to settle, having formerly been nomadic people, so people who moved constantly, and were forced to settle in southwest Algeria in a place called Tindouf, which is also an Algerian military base. So there's a long history, it's a contested history, and what we ultimately have now is around 150,000 people who have been living in camps based in the Sahara Desert in southwest Algeria since 1975, which means that you have children, grandchildren born into a displacement situation, where it's impossible to grow food or have livelihoods which are sustainable, so very much dependent on externally provided assistance from different humanitarian organizations and from different states. So that's that's one of many different protracted displacement situations. So people who've been living in refugee camps or outside of their countries of origin for not just a few years, not just decades, but as we know, nearly 100 years of displacement, and of being without international protection and without documentation, without the prospect of a stable political future.
Tarek?
So, like my book is really about the civil war in Lebanon, which is the product of these refugee crises, namely the Palestinian refugee crisis and the effects that had on the region as a whole, where you have refugees living in camps, basically, and we're not given citizenship. I mean, in some cases because of the right to return, but also because of the sectarian politics of a country like Lebanon. So until this day, this is from 1948 till today, they don't have a citizenship. They have kind of a paper that says they can live in Lebanon or they can work, but not all jobs. So this is really was a big problem, and this is also part of the kind of the Palestinian military struggle against Israel, but also that ended up destabilizing the region as well. So you have a domino effect. So it's not just simply, and what we see today in Gaza is also like a lot of the refugee camps, people who are moved from one part of the country to another because of the that border that comes and separates. So it's really, I mean, and these eventually becomes, I mean, some of them becomes like like Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon, or like shanty towns. I mean, eventually they start building with stone. It's not like they continue to live with in tents. I mean, although they started out. And now you have Syrian refugees in Lebanon who were displaced by the war in Syria, starting in 2000.
Oh, wait a minute. You're talking about refugee camps where the people have little hope of self-sustenance because they can't grow anything, and this utter dependence on aid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So aid becomes an industry also.
Yeah.
Like AIDS becomes, and Elena's work, Didier Fassin. I mean, a lot of people have worked on this kind of aid as not just simply, okay, I'm helping you out now, but it becomes a whole economy that is there. So in order for me to have a job as an aid worker, you also need to be a refugee. So it becomes, it's like the security system at the airport go through, right? I mean, so it becomes an industry.
Yeah.
And that is problematic. I mean, it has good intentions, obviously, but it takes a life of its own. And it almost like, but what about returning to my home? What about me having state that is mine, so I can feel like this is my country? So basically, this international organization replace what the state or your and you become dependent on that. And you get checks, like Syrian refugees in Lebanon get checks from certain aid agencies. And of course, that makes some Lebanese resentful because with the economic meltdown, because they're not getting those checks and dollars. And so it also creates tension within the community. I mean, so you're kind of, it's the displacement is not just of the people, it's a ripple effect. That's what we need to understand. It's a ripple effect.
And also generations, as Professor Elena was saying, they're not going anywhere.
Yeah. So what's also important to recognize is that there is this aid system that children are born into and that people grow up. But refugee camps are also home. And this is also where people decide how they live their lives, how they support themselves, but also how they support others. So on the one hand, people need to continue to receive aid. So they need to represent themselves to show themselves as good refugees who are worthy of receiving aid, on the one hand. But they're also, as Tarek just said, and as I explore in my research, there are also people who receive other displaced people. So it's not just that my own children are refugees, but also that I may have new neighbours who've arrived from another displacement situation. So my husband is a Palestinian refugee from Badawi refugee camp in North Lebanon, for example. Badawi refugee camp was established in the 1950s because of the Nakba, because of the Palestinian catastrophe, when Palestinians had to flee historic Palestine, what became Israel. And this was home to Palestinians, but it also has been home to Lebanese who've been displaced. So not just now, as we see, but also in 2006, when Israel invaded southern Lebanon, Badawi refugee camp was home and host and offered sanctuary to Lebanese who'd been displaced from southern Lebanon and also from Beirut. It was host to Palestinians displaced from the south of Lebanon, also from the Nahr al-Badid refugee camp, which is in North Lebanon, which was destroyed by the Lebanese government in the mid-2000s. It's been host and home and sanctuary to people from Syria, which includes Syrians, but also Palestinians who were living in Syria, Iraqis who had fled Iraq during the occupation of Iraq and who had tried to find safety in Syria, but then were moved on again, so became refugees twice, three times, four times, and came to Badawi. They were Kurds, so stateless people who were Kurdish, who had been displaced again, coming back to the Ottoman Empire, people who had lived in Turkey, who had lived in Iraq, who had lived in Syria, and had been subjected to different forms of violence and persecution, also moved from Syria to a place like Badawi. So this is an urban camp in the case of Badawi. So there are camps in the desert, there are camps in urban spaces and cities. So it's an urban camp like Badawi, which is 1 kilometer square, home to tens of thousands of Palestinians, of Lebanese, Syrians, Iraqis, Kurds, multiply displaced Palestinians. So these are really multinational camps. So they're both a space which is identified as Palestinian, but it's much more than that. And people are supporting one another, and it's complex. And there's also tension because some people get aid and some people don't get aid, because the system makes a difference between people on the basis of their nationality, on the basis of which documents they have, and they have different futures depending on who they are. So it's not just the aid that they receive today, but will they have the right to return, as Tarek said, or will they be forced to return to, for example, to Syria? Will they be deported to their country of origin, which isn't safe for them to return to? Or will they have the right to return to Palestine, as the international system says that Palestinian refugees should have the right to return to the place from which they were expelled? So there's a tension. People want to return to their place of origin, to their home. In some contexts, politically, they are allowed to return to their country of origin. Sometimes they're deported and expelled by force, such as people being expelled throughout history to Syria, for example. In other times, they're desperate to return to a place of origin that no longer exists, so it's been wiped off the map. Or that the state says that they can't return to because the international system won't allow it for political, diplomatic, geopolitical reasons.
You know, you just made me very sad, and I'm going to ask Professor Tarek on the other hand, because you talk about voices, but in his memoir, he gives a voice, and in one paragraph, he talks about the mother who gave him away, his brother and sister left, and I was getting, all emotional reading the book. Um, and I'm trying to, and I'm sure the audience is, wrap their head around, because the confusion, the cloudiness, the past merging with the present, the longing, uh, it it's hard to have voice.
Yeah. It's, I mean, this is also like in the midst of all this chaos. I mean, what's a little child's voice? And what's anyone's voice, really? And this is why, to come back to your initial question, is how do we humanize and rehumanize these people, that they are not just numbers or refugees or displaced, but what kind of stories do they have, and what kind of voice do they have, that we need to also, what kind of personal stories they have, a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with the whole Middle East and with that part of the world and Africa. I mean, that's almost, especially its representation in the, quote unquote West, is that it's conflict, it's war, it's refugees, it's, and there is no voice, and there is no personal story, and there are no mothers and mother child relations that might be talked about and brought into the picture and be connected to the crises that are happening, that are political, that are otherwise. So I, my work, I mean, with the trials of Arab modernity, these travelers who go to London and Paris in the 19th century, I mean, their bodies, I mean, they're breaking down. I mean, they can't deal with the cold. Can you imagine someone from Cairo in the 1820s going to Paris, and the sun doesn't come out for weeks and weeks, and it's cold, and he, and he's freaking out, and he's hallucinating, and he doesn't know what's happening to him. And the same for someone in London and Oxford and Cambridge, and he can't eat the food. He's like, where's my food, where's my stuffed grape leaves, where's the good food and the spices, and he's like talking about it, and he's asked to talk about the culture and the politics, but he can't eat, and he's fainting. And he describes this in his book. So I was attracted to
Mhm.
these people who are real, who are human, who have bodies, who have tastes, who are missing
Mhm.
home, who are suffering. And that's, it's a suffering that's not just like numbers that we hear about and it's in mass, but it is personal, and and it has a voice. And that's why I wanted also to write a little bit about where I come from, because I'm not just simply an academic who ends up writing about these travelers who end up breaking down. I mean I was also going to something similar. I mean, I arrived in the US in the in the mid 90s, and my body's going crazy. I mean, you have rashes, and I don't, I knew English. I saw, I thought I could handle it, but there is something visceral. There's something in your body. There's something that's not right. That's reacting to the place that is missing home. That's pulling you in another direction. And this is also displacement. This is also the part of the story that we need to bring in here. And it's not just simply a legal or a political or an international law, but it's a human story as well.
Yeah, I think that in the book, wait a minute, it's the first one, The Ideal Refugee, Professor Elena is talking about the pull. And I was wondering, how do you get to the voices? You're not a refugee.
Mhm.
Well, you might be. How the hell I know? You know, but you're not a refugee. In some ways, you represent the aid community. If hello, shot. um, how do you control your feelings? Tarek has been on the couch. Have you been on the couch? How do you control your feelings at the devastation?
So
Not that I'm
I've
a shrink.
Yeah. So you're right. I'm not a refugee. I'm very, very fortunate to be the holder of two powerful passports. So I'm Spanish, so I have the Spanish passport, and I'm also British, so I have the UK passport. So I'm very fortunate not to have been born into a displacement situation. In fact, I'm the child of the subject of two states, which has occupied and created displacement around the world. Absolutely. I am the mother of a half Palestinian child, or a Palestinian child. So I do understand on a personal level as well. My mother-in-law lives in Badawi refugee camp. My nephews and nieces are Palestinian refugees who live in a camp and whose futures are currently under siege. So I do understand that in a visceral manner as well. And for my daughter, home is also Badawi refugee camp. And it's a space that is violent, but it's also which is full of booza, full of ice cream and joy and happiness and delicious food and love. And this is why it's complex, because these are places that are violent and that people can't live dignified lives in. But it's also home and it's sanctuary, and it's a complex relationship. So how do I, as a citizen, engage with and listen? Because people have voices. So again, this comes back to whose voices are listened to, and how do we engage with them as human voices, as voices of experience, as voices of knowledge. So it's not just listening, but listening deeply. So there are different ways of doing that. We can do interviews. We can spend time living in places which are hosting displaced people. So what would be called an ethnography. So spending a long period of time living in the community where you're conducting research. But you can also do different forms of listening through working with people who are displaced, through ensuring that you're listening to their own accounts as they've written them themselves. So people write poetry, people express themselves and document their own experiences, not only through narration or oral history, so recounting through words their own experiences, but also through creative writing, through this wonderful accounts such as Mahmoud Darwish and many other poets who are documenting experiences of displacement in their own voices. I've been conducting research in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey for the last 6-7 years, and there are different ways that we've been working together as teams. I have colleagues who are Syrian, who are Palestinian, who are Iraqi, who have been documenting their own experiences and the experiences of other members of their communities. Lebanese citizens also engaging with their neighbors and their colleagues and their students. So there are different ways that we can listen. The voices are there. The voices are there. It's a matter of how we listen to them and what spaces exist for people to be able to explain their own experiences, but also their own desires, what they want, what protection they need, what their priorities are. And it's not to be assumed by the international community. And it's not, and the international community, although Tarek is absolutely right, that many people have very good intentions as humanitarian workers. But often the humanitarian system makes problems. It creates problems that didn't exist. So when you come in as an international worker, but you only give the checks or the money or the aid to one group of people, but not to others.
You can't. There's a door shut on us. We can't foster kids out of there or foster families. I mean, you know that because you would quickly foster your own. But I want to go, as you're talking about that, to South. This seems to be a new kind of movement. Well, new to my ears. What do I know? You know,
Yeah.
speak, Tarek.
Yeah, I mean, this idea has existed, and it was also a response to colonialism, but it was very strong.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm.
It was very strong in the 50s, already in the 50s and the 60s, and where different countries from India, the global South, really, kind of Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, coming to themselves after, the big wave of decolonization after the Second World War, and saying, we are going to build a kind of a liberated culture, not only liberated land, but a liberated culture. How are we going to bring the African with the Arab, with the Latin American, with the Indian, with the, and all, kind of build, write, think, come up with new societies, revolutionaries, liberated, anti-colonial. So this idea, and this is what eventually became known as the Third World. I mean, the Global South. I mean, these are old words. These come from the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
And so today there is a kind of a return of this. And of course, at the time there was a lot of international conferences in Bandung and like various places. People like Jamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt, was one of the kind of darlings of this kind of third worldist or global South movements. So I mean, today it is operating more at the cultural level, especially, in our academic setting. There is a strong awareness that Europe or the West doesn't have to be the center through which we communicate. Of course, we're also aware we're at British and American universities, so we're aware also of the importance of these institutions. But there is a lot of effort to read these literatures together, to think of these histories together, and revive this idea of anti-colonial, decolonial practices in order to imagine something different, because there is a real fatigue with the systems that have been forced on us. Like there is a real disappointment with the promises of modernity, of liberalism, of democracy, of the international system. So there is people are disappointed. They feel like they want something different, and the system is not fulfilling their needs. It's not bringing the freedom and the prosperity and the dignity that they feel they deserve.
Okay,
So
so let me interject. Do you think if there's an old saying about the hand that's up and the hand that's down, and if I give you independence from me, why should I help you do a damn thing? I want to keep you in some sort of obeisance. You see what I'm saying?
yeah.
So we get jacked. But what about women? The stories I hear are horrible.
So again, well, that's a very tricky and complex question, of course. Displaced women, numerically, the largest number of people who are displaced are internally displaced. So they're displaced within their own countries. Now that's the big unheard situation. So we're talking about voice. We hear a lot about refugees because people have crossed an international border. So it becomes a concern to countries outside of their own. But actually, most people who are displaced are internally displaced. If we look at Gaza, the big crisis is actually people not being able to move, and not being able to find safety, and they're displaced internally as well as being refugees who've been displaced. But we have, in most conflict situations, people are not able to safely reach a border to cross. Again, we see that in Lebanon at the moment, over 1 million people displaced by the Israeli bombardments across Lebanon. People are internally displaced within the country. And amongst those people, we know that in any society, about 50% of the population is females, so women and girls. So that is reflected in displaced populations as well. So we have large numbers of women, large numbers of girls who are displaced, as well as large numbers of men and of boys. And different people have different experiences. And it's not just dependent on gender, but also dependent on their age, on who they're traveling with, if they're able to travel as a family, or if they're traveling individually, if they have living relatives, which again, we have entire families being killed in many situations. So depending on who you're traveling with, you might have access to different forms of protection. You might have different responsibilities if you're caring for your children, for your parents, if you have older parents who you're traveling with. So there's no one story for a refugee woman or a refugee man, because it depends on who that person is. Albert Einstein was a refugee man, and we don't think of him intrinsically as vulnerable. People who are displaced are made vulnerable to different types of violence and exploitation because of the political situation that they are in, because of the environment and the systems that exist to provide support and protection, or don't provide them with protection. So there's no one story, but there are vulnerabilities and risks that people experience because of political decisions. There's nothing inevitable about vulnerability and displacement. People are effectively sacrificed for political reasons. And that's why when we think about displacement, we don't just need humanitarian band-aids to provide a bit of aid to keep people alive for one more day. We need to ensure that there are political solutions and that conflicts are prevented in the first place, but also that arms sales stop, that bombardments do not continue, that people are able to access safe spaces where those vulnerabilities are reduced, because those are politically produced vulnerabilities. And I know that Tarek wants to come in as well to discuss this more.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is, there was a lot about gender, at least in Arabic literature and Lebanese war literature. People wrote a lot about the role of women, but I mean, women played all kinds of roles. You have Layla Khalid, you have revolutionary women, but you also have women who took positions of care and comforting of the community. So it's not, so this question of gender has really, we've seen multiple facets of it in literature, in politics, at all levels. And you've seen also women who incited their boys to go and shoot at the other village and so on. So you have really a whole span here that needs to be, acknowledged. But I think ultimately the question of displacement is really very important, and we don't think about it, this internal displacement. I mean, growing up in Lebanon, I mean, when the country was divided, I mean, half of the people were displaced. I mean, they had to go into the part of town that they thought belong, their sect or they thought they were going to be safe in, and they left their house just that sometimes is just 20 minutes away, but they can't go back to it because they would get killed. And then the city was divided. I mean, the whole country had a border, and that's one country, and a very small country. I mean, it's like the size of New Jersey or something. So and this is the kind of things that you have to live with. And then all of a sudden, and then after the war they went back and they rebuilt. But how do you go back and rebuild? Do you really trust living there again after atrocities by different communities that also killed each other? And these are from the same country, supposedly. So you also, this leaves marks, this leaves deep wounds as well.
It does. You talk about that in the book. You packed it up in the suitcase and brought it with you.
Exactly.
But unfortunately, we'll have to end. Both of you have got me conspiring to get you to do a seminar on this, and I will continue to conspire, because I think there needs to be an audience you can see and talk about these things, because we didn't get a chance to talk about the fact of people traveling to the West to get an education, falling in love over here, having children, but longing, that longing for home. But then coming back, divorce happens. I'm telling you a story, Tarek.
Yes,
Divorce
yes.
happens, and dad remarries, and this other woman, she's got to stake her claim. These are human foibles that are always happening, right? Whether you're in a refugee camp, not internally displaced, or internally displaced. So I got to bring you out of London. I'll figure that out. I got it. Well, Dartmouth is up above me. Uh, this has been, and I want each of you to take a moment and think about the displacement. And I'm going to ask the really critical, I think, critical question. Don't people also have the right to fight for their own countries? Why do we give them some rights and take others away?
Yeah. No, I mean, these
I'm
are,
listening.
yeah. I mean, I absolutely, and these are guaranteed by international organizations. So, but I want to say, because I know we're ending. I mean, I want to say, the human always triumphs,
I
even in the
pray.
worst. I believe in the human. The human, the voice will carry through, and no matter you live in refugee camp. I mean, life always grows somewhere. It grows out of a rock. You see a plant comes out of a rock, and you say, how did that life come out of a rock? And I really, and we need to believe in that, and we need to also remember that as we do our work, and as we think of this whole world, that and especially in the region, especially now. But we need to also listen and watch that plant comes out of a rock, because there is something that's a miracle as well. That's a
Mhm.
miracle we need to acknowledge, and that's a strength, and that's resistance, that life somehow find its way despite it all.
Mm.
Professor Elena, last words.
Thank you. Absolutely. What we see is, even in the midst of genocide, solidarity, care, people caring for one another, and trying desperately to find that space for growth, for the flowers to bloom, as Tarek just said. People just supporting their children, trying in the midst of genocidal violence to celebrate their children's birthdays, trying to find moments of joy. And that's what we see as the absolute act of resistance, and the absolute determination to not just stay alive, but to live meaningful lives for themselves, for their children, for their families, for their loved ones, for their neighbors. People will find that way, absolutely, to not just care for themselves selfishly, but to engage in acts of mutual aid and of solidarity, and of finding joy, and insisting that they have the right to not just be alive, but to be happy, and to be able to enjoy life in the way that dignified
Well,
experience requires.
yeah. No, these are two very good things. I have no idea what happy is. But I think that, I was questioning, and I'm going to shut up. How do we distinguish between people who are displaced or who are running away from illegal, corrupt governments that they wish to overturn? Are they terrorists or are they freedom fighters? And I'll leave it. I don't look like that, Tarek. And we'll come back, and definitely I will be back. Elena, don't delete me when you see me on your email. And Tarek, you do the same. This has been enlightening. My gosh, you all know so much that I don't know, that I can't stop probing. So I will be back to both of you, and I'm going to ask you to stay after we end. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen for Muslim Network TV. On the program Critical Talk, we've had an interesting discussion about, boy, just about everything touching on refugees and migrants, displacements, and it can't end here. We have to have more discussions. We have to invite more people into the discussion. Assalamu alaikum.